Good evening and welcome. Tonight, we are going to take a slow, quiet step backward in time into a world that feels familiar, orderly, and just a little unreal. A world where evenings were governed by routine, lawns were trimmed with near-military precision, and the glow of a black and white television softly lit living rooms across America. This is the United States in the early 1950s, a place often remembered as calm, stable, and safe. But beneath that polished surface lived a very particular idea of what it meant to be a good parent. In this era, parenting was not treated as a personal journey or an emotional relationship. It was a responsibility structured, rule-bound, and deeply tied to social expectations. To raise a child was to shape a future citizen. And to shape that citizen properly, many believed, required firmness, consistency, and above all, authority. The post-war years were a time of rebuilding and reassurance. After the chaos of the Great Depression and the trauma of World War I, Americans craved predictability. Families moved into new suburbs filled with identical houses, identical appliances, and identical dreams. Inside those homes, parents were expected to provide not just food and shelter, but moral order. Childhood was not something to be explored freely. It was something to be guided carefully, shaped deliberately, and corrected when necessary. The idea that discipline equaled love was widely accepted. A well-behaved child was seen as a reflection of successful parenting, while misbehavior suggested failure, not just personal failure, but social failure. Parents felt watched, measured, and judged by neighbors, teachers, doctors, and even strangers at the grocery store. To raise a child who talked back, ignored rules, or acted out was to risk public embarrassment and quiet condemnation. In this environment, parenting advice did not come from lived experience or emotional instinct. It came from authority. From books written by experts. From pamphlets handed out at clinics. From magazines stacked neatly on coffee tables. From men in suits and doctors in white coats who spoke with certainty and confidence. These experts told parents that structure was essential. That children needed clear rules, strict schedules, and immediate consequences. Love alone was not enough. In fact, too much affection was often described as dangerous, something that could spoil a child, weaken their character, or leave them unprepared for the real world. A firm hand was praised as responsible and forward-thinking. The language of the time framed childhood as raw material. Children were not yet complete people, they were projects. And projects, as any mid-century manual would suggest, required careful management. Meals happened at fixed times. Bedtime was not a negotiation. Emotional outbursts were discouraged. Questions were answered briefly, if at all. Obedience was considered comforting, not restrictive. Parents were encouraged to believe that consistency mattered more than understanding. If a rule existed, it had to be enforced. If a boundary was crossed, it had to be corrected. The specific method mattered less than the message. Authority must be maintained. This belief fit neatly into the broader culture of the 1950s. It was a decade that valued hierarchy. Fathers went to work. Mothers managed the home. Teachers taught. Doctors instructed. Children listened. Everyone had a role, and stability depended on each person staying within it. There was also fear, quiet, unspoken fear. Fear of disorder. Fear of delinquency. Fear that without strict guidance, children might drift toward trouble, rebellion, or moral weakness. Newspapers and magazines warned about juvenile misbehavior as if it were a growing threat. Films and radio programs suggested that small acts of defiance could lead to much larger problems later on. In response, parents were encouraged to act early and decisively. A misstep corrected today was believed to prevent serious issues tomorrow. Discipline was framed as preventive care, not punishment. A way of guiding a child back onto the proper path before that path disappeared entirely. Many parents truly believed they were doing the right thing. They were following advice that came wrapped in confidence and reassurance. They were told that clear authority created security, that children felt safer when rules were firm, and that guidance even when uncomfortable was a form of care. And because nearly everyone believed this, it became self-reinforcing. Parents saw their neighbors doing the same. Teachers echoed the same ideas in classrooms. Television families modeled calm authority and obedient children. There was little room for doubt, and even less encouragement to question the system. In this world, children grew up learning the rules before they learned their own emotions. They learned when to speak, when to stay quiet, and how to read the mood of a room. They understood that order mattered, that expectations were fixed, that consequences were certain. From the outside, the 1950s family looked serene. Dinners at the table, polite conversations, clean clothes, structured days. But inside many homes, parenting was less about dialogue and more about direction. Less about exploration and more about correction. This is not a story about villains or cruelty. It is a story about certainty. About a generation of parents who believed deeply in the advice they were given, who trusted authority, who wanted stability for their children and safety for their society. Tonight's story begins here, in that moment of collective belief. Before debates about emotional development. Before parenting styles became personal choices. Before childhood was understood as something delicate and deeply individual. This is the world where good parenting meant control, consistency, and confidence. Where love was often shown through structure. And where the idea of discipline was inseparable from the idea of responsibility. So settle in, let the pace slow, and allow yourself to drift into this carefully ordered past. Because to understand why certain practices became so normal, we first need to understand the world that made them feel necessary. And that world begins in the quiet suburbs of the 1950s where order was comfort. Authority was reassurance, and parenting followed rules as carefully laid out as the streets themselves. Parenting advice in the 1950s did not come casually or experimentally. It arrived with confidence, structure, and an almost instructional tone, presenting itself as a clear solution to the uncertainties of raising children in a rapidly changing world. Books, pamphlets, magazine columns, and radio programs spoke with one voice. Children needed firm guidance, strict routines, and unquestioned obedience in order to grow into stable, responsible adults. These manuals were often written by psychologists, pediatricians, or social commentators who positioned themselves as authorities not just on children, but on the future of society itself. Their language was precise and commanding. Parents were encouraged to follow schedules to the minute, to regulate feeding times, sleep patterns, and daily activities with near-military consistency. Spontaneity was discouraged. Flexibility was seen as weakness. A well-run household, according to these experts, mirrored a well-run institution. At the heart of this philosophy was the belief that children were naturally impulsive and undisciplined. Left to their own instincts, many experts warned, children would develop habits that were difficult or even impossible to correct later. Early childhood was framed as a critical window, a narrow passage during which behavior had to be shaped correctly before it hardened into permanent character traits. Obedience, therefore, was not just desirable. It was essential. A child who listened promptly and followed instructions without protest was seen as emotionally healthy and socially prepared. Compliance was interpreted as security. Resistance, on the other hand, was described as a sign of deeper problems, either indulgent parenting or a failure to establish authority early enough. Physical routines played a central role in this approach. Feeding schedules were rigid, often ignoring a child's immediate cues in favor of the clock. Crying was frequently framed as something to be managed, not soothed. Parents were told that responding too quickly or too warmly could encourage dependency. Comfort, according to many manuals, had to be balanced carefully against the risk of spoiling. Emotional distance was often described as healthy restraint. Parents were advised to remain calm, neutral, and consistent, even when enforcing rules. Displays of strong emotion, whether from the child or the parent, were considered disruptive to discipline. Love, these manuals insisted, should be steady and controlled, not reactive. Underlying these recommendations was a deep trust in structure itself. Structure was portrayed as protective, shaping not only behavior but inner strength. A child raised with clear limits, predictable consequences, and firm expectations was believed to develop self-control naturally over time. In contrast, a child raised with too much choice or emotional negotiation was thought to struggle with authority later in life. This belief was reinforced by the broader cultural environment. The 1950s valued systems, hierarchies, and clear lines of responsibility. Schools emphasized order and discipline. Workplaces rewarded conformity and reliability. The military, still fresh in public memory after World War I, was often held up as an example of how structure produced strength and unity. Parenting advice mirrored these values almost exactly. Many manuals framed child rearing as a scientific process. Charts, timelines, and step-by-step instructions were common. Parents were encouraged to treat problems methodically, identify the behavior, apply the prescribed response, and maintain consistency until the behavior changed. Emotional nuance rarely entered the conversation. What mattered was outcome, not experience. This scientific framing gave parents a sense of control. In an era marked by global uncertainty and lingering fears of instability, clear rules felt reassuring. If parenting could be reduced to a set of instructions, then success felt attainable. Follow the rules, apply the methods, and the result would be a well-adjusted child. Doctors played a particularly influential role in spreading these ideas. Pediatric visits often included advice not just on physical health, but on discipline, sleep training, and behavior management. When a doctor recommended firmness, it carried immense weight. Parents rarely questioned medical authority, especially when it aligned with prevailing social norms. Printed advice reinforced this trust. Parenting books were written in confident, authoritative tones, rarely acknowledging uncertainty or individual differences between children. Variations in temperament were often minimized. What worked for one child, readers were told, would work for most if applied correctly and consistently. This left little room for intuition. Parents who felt uncertain or emotionally conflicted were often encouraged to override those feelings in favor of expert guidance. Doubt was framed as weakness. Confidence came from adherence to the rules, not from responsiveness to the child. Over time, these ideas shaped not just behavior but expectations. Parents came to believe that good parenting looked a certain way: orderly homes, predictable routines, respectful children. When reality did not match that image, the response was often more structure, not reflection. Importantly, many parents found genuine comfort in these systems. Strict routines simplified daily life. Clear rules reduced ambiguity. Obedience, when achieved, created calm and predictability within the household. In a world that felt increasingly complex, this simplicity was appealing. Children, meanwhile, learned to navigate these expectations carefully. They adapted to schedules, rules, and authority figures with remarkable speed. Many became skilled at reading cues, anticipating consequences, and adjusting behavior accordingly. Compliance became second nature, not always because of fear, but because it was the expected norm. This approach to parenting was rarely questioned at the time. It was supported by experts, reinforced by institutions, and mirrored in popular culture. Television families depicted children who listened, respected authority, and rarely challenged rules. These portrayals further normalized the idea that obedience was both natural and desirable. Yet beneath the surface, this rigid framework left little space for individuality. Emotional expression was often secondary to behavioral control. Curiosity was encouraged only within approved boundaries. The goal was not self-discovery, but social readiness. Still, for many families, these methods felt like common sense. They reflected the values of the time: discipline, respect, and order. Parenting manuals did not present themselves as harsh or uncaring. On the contrary, they framed strictness as a form of responsibility, a way to prepare children for a world that demanded resilience and conformity. In this context, authoritative advice was not experienced as oppressive, but as supportive. It offered parents a roadmap. It promised results. And it reassured them that by following these rules, they were doing their duty not just to their children, but to society as a whole. This belief in rigid guidance would shape an entire generation's understanding of childhood. It set the foundation for how discipline was justified, how obedience was praised, and how authority became woven into the fabric of everyday family life. In the 1950s, discipline inside the home was rarely seen as merely a personal or family matter. It was framed as something far larger, an obligation tied directly to the health of society itself. Raising children was not only about nurturing individuals. It was about protecting the future of the nation. A well-disciplined child was believed to grow into a responsible citizen, while a poorly disciplined one was viewed as a potential threat to social order. This belief did not arise in isolation. It was shaped by decades of upheaval. The Great Depression had exposed how fragile systems could be. World War I had demonstrated the consequences of instability and disorder on a global scale. When peace finally arrived, Americans were deeply invested in preserving it. Stability became a shared cultural goal, and discipline was seen as one of its most reliable foundations. Children, in this framework, represented both hope and risk. They were the next generation of workers, voters, and leaders, but only if shaped correctly. Without firm guidance, many feared that children might grow into adults who challenged authority, ignored rules, or disrupted the carefully rebuilt social structure. Parenting, therefore, carried moral weight far beyond the walls of the home. Schools echoed this message constantly. Teachers were not just educators. They were guardians of order. Classrooms emphasized obedience, quiet attention, and respect for authority. When children struggled to conform, the assumption was often that discipline at home had been insufficient. Parents were expected to reinforce school rules, not question them. Consistency between home and institution was considered essential. Neighborhoods also played a role in enforcing these standards. Suburban communities were close-knit, but that closeness came with scrutiny. Children played outside together, rode bicycles through identical streets, and attended the same schools. Their behavior was visible. A child who acted out did not go unnoticed, and neither did the parents. Reputation mattered, and discipline was a public signal of responsibility. Parents were keenly aware of this social pressure. Many felt that they were not just raising their own children, but representing their family's values to the entire community. A well-behaved child reflected positively on the household. A defiant or unruly one invited quiet judgment. Discipline became a form of social compliance, reinforcing shared norms through everyday interactions. Government messaging subtly reinforced these ideas. Cold War rhetoric emphasized unity, loyalty, and moral strength. The ideal citizen was dependable, respectful, and cooperative. Parenting advice often aligned with these national narratives, suggesting that early discipline prepared children to resist negative influences and remain loyal to shared values. Popular media amplified the message. Films, television programs, and radio shows regularly depicted children who learned lessons through correction and authority. Misbehavior was resolved not through long conversations, but through firm guidance and clear consequences. By the end of the story, order was restored, and the family unit stood as a symbol of social stability. In this cultural climate, questioning discipline could feel almost unpatriotic. Permissiveness was often associated with weakness, moral decline, or even societal decay. Parents were warned sometimes explicitly that failing to correct behavior early could contribute to larger social problems later. Discipline was not framed as harshness, but as foresight. This belief extended beyond the family and into public institutions. Schools openly used corrective measures as tools of authority. The presence of visible, disciplinary instruments was intended to deter misbehavior and reinforce hierarchy. These practices were rarely challenged, because they aligned with the broader idea that authority maintained order and order preserved peace. Religious institutions also supported this worldview. Sermons and teachings often emphasized obedience, respect, and moral guidance. Parents were encouraged to see discipline as a form of stewardship guiding children away from temptation and toward proper behavior. Authority within the family was presented as both natural and necessary. Many parents found reassurance in this framing. It transformed the difficult task of discipline into something meaningful and purposeful. Correcting a child's behavior was not just about the moment. It was about contributing to a stable future. This perspective made firm decisions feel justified, even when emotionally challenging. Children absorbed these values quickly. They learned that rules were not arbitrary, but part of a larger system extending beyond their immediate environment. Authority figures, parents, teachers, police officers, clergy were all connected by a shared expectation of obedience. This consistency reinforced the idea that discipline was unavoidable and universal. At the same time, individuality was often secondary to conformity. Children were encouraged to fit into existing structures rather than reshape them. Questioning rules was discouraged, not because curiosity was inherently wrong, but because it risked disrupting harmony. Order was prioritized over expression. The idea of discipline as civic duty also blurred the line between care and control. Parents were told that enforcing rules protected children from future hardship. A child who learned obedience early would adapt more easily to school, work, and adult responsibilities. Discipline promised long-term success, even if it felt uncomfortable in the present. This way of thinking reduced parenting anxiety in some respects. It offered clarity. There was a right way to do things, validated by experts, institutions, and culture alike. Parents who followed these norms felt aligned with society rather than isolated in their decisions. Yet this collective certainty left little room for alternative approaches. Families who favored gentler methods often kept them private, wary of criticism. Diverging from the norm carried social risk. In communities built on sameness, difference stood out sharply. Over time, the normalization of discipline as a civic responsibility reinforced itself. Children raised under these expectations became adults who often passed them on, remembering structure as safety and authority as guidance. The system sustained itself through shared memory and cultural repetition. This belief that disciplined children created a disciplined society shaped how authority was understood for decades. It influenced parenting, education, and public policy, weaving discipline into the moral fabric of everyday life. Within this framework, discipline was rarely questioned because it felt necessary. It was not simply about correcting behavior, but about preserving a vision of order in a world that had only recently emerged from chaos. And for many, that vision was worth protecting at all costs. In the 1950s, few voices carried more influence in the American household than that of the family doctor. Medical professionals were not only trusted with physical health, but increasingly with emotional development, behavior, and parenting choices. When doctors spoke about how children should be raised, their words were rarely questioned. They were seen as neutral, scientific, and grounded in expertise. This trust gave doctors enormous power in shaping attitudes toward discipline. Many pediatricians and child development specialists of the era openly supported firm corrective methods, presenting them as reasonable, effective, and even beneficial when used properly. Their guidance was often delivered calmly, framed as common sense rather than controversy. As a result, certain practices became normalized not through cultural habit alone, but through medical endorsement. Parenting advice frequently appeared in medical journals, clinic handouts, and popular magazines written by physicians. These sources described discipline as a necessary tool for guiding behavior and building self-control. The language used was clinical and reassuring. Rather than focusing on emotional experience, it emphasized outcomes, order, obedience, and long-term stability. Doctors often explained child behavior using simplified psychological theories. Children were described as driven by impulses that needed to be managed early. If those impulses were not corrected in childhood, experts warned, they could become ingrained patterns in adulthood. From this perspective, firm intervention was seen as preventive care, similar to vaccinations or regular checkups. Importantly, these recommendations were rarely presented as harsh. Medical advice emphasized moderation, consistency, and parental calm. The message was not one of anger, but of control. Parents were told that corrective action should be predictable and emotionally restrained, reinforcing the idea that discipline was a rational process rather than an emotional response. Because these ideas came from doctors, they carried a sense of legitimacy. Parents who felt uncertain or uncomfortable often deferred to medical authority, believing that professionals understood children better than instinct or intuition ever could. When advice conflicted with a parent's feelings, the advice usually won. The clinical tone of this guidance masked how little scientific evidence actually existed. Many recommendations were based on limited observation, outdated theories, or assumptions carried over from earlier generations. Long-term studies on emotional development were rare, and the voices of children themselves were largely absent from the conversation. Yet the absence of evidence did not weaken confidence. On the contrary, the certainty with which doctors spoke reinforced trust. Advice was delivered in absolutes rather than probabilities. Parents were told what worked, not what might work. This clarity was comforting in an era that valued expertise and distrusted ambiguity. Medical authority also helped separate discipline from morality. Corrective methods were framed as health decisions rather than ethical ones. This framing allowed parents to see discipline as responsible and rational, rather than personal or emotional. It became something one did because it was recommended, not because one wanted to. Pediatric visits often included guidance on sleep training, feeding schedules, and behavior management. Doctors advised parents to establish authority early, warning that inconsistency could confuse children and weaken parental influence. When these messages were repeated over years of checkups, they became deeply ingrained. This medical backing also protected parents from social doubt. When questioned by relatives or neighbors, parents could point to professional advice as justification. The doctor had said it was necessary. The doctor had said it was healthy. In this way, medical authority acted as a shield against criticism. Hospitals and clinics distributed printed materials that reinforced these ideas. Pamphlets outlined ideal routines and responses to misbehavior, often presenting them as universally applicable. Differences in temperament, environment, or emotional sensitivity were rarely acknowledged. One method was expected to fit all. This approach aligned closely with the broader cultural belief in efficiency and systems. Just as machines were designed to function predictably, children were expected to respond predictably to consistent input. If a method did not work, the solution was usually more consistency, not reevaluation. Doctors themselves were products of their time. Their training reflected prevailing social norms, and many had been raised under the same disciplinary systems they now recommended. Their advice was not intentionally harmful, but it was shaped by a limited understanding of emotional development and a strong belief in authority. Media amplified medical voices even further. Physicians appeared on radio programs, wrote newspaper columns, and were quoted in parenting magazines. Their credentials were highlighted prominently, reinforcing the idea that science supported strict discipline. Alternative viewpoints, when they appeared at all, were often framed as risky or experimental. For parents, this constant reinforcement created a sense of inevitability. If doctors, teachers, and media all agreed, then the approach must be correct. Questioning it could feel irresponsible, even dangerous. After all, who were parents to argue with science? Children, meanwhile, learned quickly that authority was layered and interconnected. The rules at home matched the rules at school, which matched the expectations of doctors and other adults. This consistency made authority feel absolute. There was no clear place to appeal or negotiate. Over time, medical endorsement helped transform discipline from a cultural habit into a perceived necessity. It was no longer just how things had always been done, it was how things were supposed to be done. The line between guidance and correction became blurred under the weight of professional approval. This legacy would later be questioned as research expanded and new perspectives emerged. But in the 1950s, medical authority played a decisive role in shaping parenting norms. It reassured parents, silenced doubts, and embedded discipline deeply into the idea of responsible care. Within this framework, discipline was not seen as optional or subjective. It was presented as part of healthy development, endorsed by science and delivered with confidence. And because it came from trusted experts, it felt not only acceptable but necessary. Despite the confidence with which parenting guidance was delivered in the 1950s, much of it rested on surprisingly fragile foundations. The recommendations that shaped millions of households often appeared scientific and authoritative, yet they were rarely supported by rigorous research. Instead, they were built on assumptions, limited observations, and theories that reflected the cultural values of the time more than tested facts. Child development as a scientific field was still relatively young. Long-term studies on emotional growth, stress, and parent-child relationships were rare. Tools for measuring internal experiences such as fear, security, or emotional regulation were limited or non-existent. As a result, many conclusions about what children needed were based on outward behavior alone. If a child was quiet, compliant, and orderly, the method was considered successful. Experts often assumed that behavior reflected inner well-being. Calmness was equated with health. Obedience was interpreted as emotional stability. Difficulty or resistance, on the other hand, was viewed as a problem to be corrected, rather than a signal to be understood. These interpretations felt logical within the mindset of the era, but they left little room for complexity. Much of the advice was shaped by older psychological theories that emphasized control over expression. Some drew loosely from early psychoanalytic ideas, while others relied on behaviorist thinking that focused on cause and effect. These frameworks prioritized observable outcomes and predictability, not internal emotional states. As long as the child appeared well-adjusted on the surface, deeper questions were rarely asked. There was also a strong tendency to generalize. Guidance was often presented as universal, applying equally to all children regardless of temperament, environment, or family dynamics. The idea that children might respond differently to the same approach was acknowledged only minimally, if at all. Variation was treated as inconvenience rather than reality. Many recommendations were passed down through professional tradition rather than discovered through experimentation. Doctors learned from senior colleagues. Authors cited other authors. Parenting books referenced earlier manuals, repeating advice that had already become familiar. Over time, repetition created credibility. If something had been said often enough, it felt true. Parents were rarely told about uncertainty. Advice was delivered in definitive terms. This is how children develop. This is what works. This is what fails. The absence of nuance made guidance easier to follow, but it also discouraged critical thinking. Parents were not invited to observe, adapt, or question. They were expected to comply. This certainty was especially powerful because it aligned with social expectations. A culture that valued order and authority naturally favored explanations that supported those values. Advice that questioned strict structure would have felt unsettling, even irresponsible. As a result, theories that reinforced discipline were embraced, while alternatives remained on the margins. Importantly, children's perspectives were almost entirely missing from the conversation. Research rarely asked how children experienced discipline or structure. Their inner worlds, their fears, confusions, or attempts to understand rules were largely invisible to experts. Childhood was studied from the outside, not from within. Outcomes were also measured narrowly. Success was defined as short-term behavior change rather than long-term emotional development. If a child stopped acting out, the method was deemed effective. Little attention was paid to how that compliance was achieved or what it might cost internally over time. Because long-term follow-up was uncommon, potential delayed effects went unnoticed. A child who appeared well-behaved at age 6 might struggle with confidence or emotional expression years later, but those connections were rarely traced back to early experiences. Without data, there was little reason to question existing practices. The authority of professionals further insulated these ideas from scrutiny. Doctors and experts were respected figures whose opinions carried weight far beyond their evidence. When they spoke with certainty, and that certainty became a substitute for proof. Parents, for their part, were not equipped or encouraged to evaluate the quality of the advice they received. Scientific literacy was limited, and access to alternative viewpoints was rare. Most families relied on a small number of trusted sources, all of which tended to reinforce the same message. This created a closed system. Advice supported cultural norms, and cultural norms validated the advice. Within that loop, weak evidence was rarely exposed. Instead, it was strengthened through repetition, authority, and social approval. To question these methods would have required not just scientific curiosity, but social courage. It meant challenging doctors, teachers, and widely accepted beliefs. For many parents, that felt unnecessary or even risky, especially when the advice appeared to work on the surface. It is important to understand that this lack of evidence was not due to neglect or bad intentions. The tools simply did not exist yet. Emotional development was difficult to study, and the language to describe it was still forming. Experts worked within the limits of their time. However, the result was a parenting framework that appeared solid but rested on untested ground. Practices became entrenched not because they were proven, but because they fit neatly into the worldview of the era. As years passed, these assumptions hardened into tradition. What began as guidance slowly transformed into expectation. Parents were not just advised to follow certain methods. They were judged by them. The line between recommendation and requirement blurred. This reliance on unproven ideas would later become a point of reflection and debate. As research methods improved and new voices entered the field, long-held beliefs would be questioned. But in the 1950s, few pauses were taken to ask whether confidence had outpaced understanding. At the time, the advice felt modern, scientific, and reassuring. It promised clarity in an uncertain world. And because it came from trusted authorities, Its weak foundations remained largely invisible, hidden beneath the calm surface of certainty and order. By the mid-20th century, many parents had been taught directly and indirectly that their own instincts were unreliable. Love alone, they were warned, could mislead. Emotion could cloud judgment. In contrast, expert advice was framed as objective, rational, and superior to personal feeling. As a result, trust gradually shifted away from parental intuition and toward professional authority. This shift did not happen overnight. Earlier generations had relied heavily on family tradition and community wisdom. But the rapid expansion of scientific language in the early 1900s changed how people understood responsibility. Medicine, psychology, and education increasingly presented themselves as technical fields best navigated by trained specialists. Parenting followed the same path. Experts spoke with confidence and precision. They used charts, schedules, and classifications that made child rearing appear measurable and controllable. This approach appealed to parents who wanted certainty. Faced with conflicting emotions and unpredictable behavior, many welcomed guidance that promised clarity and results. Parents were often told that feeling uncertain was a sign of inexperience. Manuals warned against giving in or letting emotions take over. A good parent, according to this advice, remained calm, consistent, and detached. Emotional reactions were framed as obstacles rather than information. When instinct conflicted with instruction, instruction usually won. Parents who felt uneasy about strict routines were encouraged to persist. If a child resisted, experts explained that resistance was expected and temporary. Doubt, they reassured, would fade once the method took effect. Medical visits reinforced this hierarchy of knowledge. Doctors did not ask parents how discipline felt. They explained how it should be done. Questions were welcomed only within narrow boundaries. Advice flowed in one direction from expert to parent. This dynamic subtly altered the parent-child relationship. Authority became externalized. Instead of responding to the child in front of them, parents responded to the expectations set by professionals. Parenting became an act of compliance as much as care. Printed materials strengthened this pattern. Parenting books rarely encouraged flexibility or adaptation. Instead, they emphasized adherence. Success depended not on sensitivity, but on consistency. Parents were instructed to follow the plan, not the moment. This approach was comforting in some ways. It removed personal responsibility for difficult decisions. If something felt uncomfortable, parents could remind themselves that they were following expert advice. Responsibility shifted from choice to obedience. Over time, this reliance reduced confidence in personal judgment. Parents learned to doubt their reactions. A child's tears might prompt concern, but manuals warned against responding too quickly. Comfort became conditional, filtered through instruction. This culture of deference also limited experimentation. Trying a different approach felt risky without professional approval. Parents feared doing harm by deviating from the recommended path. Better to follow the rules than to trust uncertainty. Children, meanwhile, sensed this shift. They learned that appeals to emotion often held little power. Rules mattered more than explanations. Authority came not just from parents, but from an invisible network of experts supporting them. The emotional cost of this system was rarely discussed. Parents who felt conflicted were encouraged to suppress those feelings. Doubt was framed as weakness. Confidence came from alignment with authority, not from reflection. Yet for many families, this approach felt responsible. In a world that valued expertise, trusting professionals seemed sensible. Doctors had training. Authors had credentials. Parents had love, but love, they were told, was not enough. This belief reshaped how success was defined. A good parent was not one who listened deeply, but one who followed guidance accurately. Parenting became a task to be performed correctly rather than a relationship to be understood. As this mindset spread, it reinforced itself. Parents raised under these systems often passed the same values to the next generation. Trust in authority became familiar, even comforting. Only later would alternative perspectives begin to question this imbalance. But at the time, trusting experts over instinct felt modern and responsible. It promised order, predictability, and reassurance. Within that promise, many parents silenced their own doubts, believing that the safest choice was to follow the rules. And in doing so, they placed expert authority at the center of family life where it would remain for decades to come. Even as strict, authority-driven parenting dominated the 1950s, it was not the only voice in the conversation. Beneath the surface of certainty, quieter contradictions were already forming. New ideas about childhood were emerging, challenging older beliefs, yet they rarely replaced them. Instead, they existed side by side, creating confusion for parents and inconsistency for children. Some experts began to suggest that affection, reassurance, and emotional warmth were important for healthy development. These voices did not necessarily reject structure or rules, but they emphasized connection alongside control. Children, they argued, were not just habits to be managed, but emotional beings shaped by relationships. However, these newer ideas often clashed with the established belief that too much warmth could weaken discipline. Parents were told to show love but not too much. To be affectionate but not indulgent. To listen but not negotiate. The boundaries between care and control were unclear, and guidance rarely explained how to balance the two. As a result, many parents attempted to combine opposing approaches. They followed rigid schedules and enforced firm rules, while also trying to express warmth and reassurance. On paper, this seemed reasonable. In practice, it often created emotional inconsistency. A child might experience comfort and closeness one moment, followed by sudden firmness the next. Rules were enforced strictly, but explanations were sometimes gentle and sometimes absent. Expectations shifted depending on which advice a parent was following that day. The household rhythm became unpredictable, not in schedule, but in emotional tone. Parents themselves often felt torn. They wanted to be loving, but feared doing harm by appearing permissive. When a child sought reassurance, parents hesitated, wondering whether comfort would encourage dependence. When a child resisted a rule, parents worried that listening too much might undermine authority. This internal conflict rarely found open discussion. Parenting manuals acknowledged disagreement among experts only briefly, if at all. Instead of encouraging reflection, they often urged parents to commit fully to one method or another, usually the more structured one. Emotional uncertainty was framed as a problem to overcome, not a signal to explore. Children absorbed these contradictions quietly. They learned that affection existed, but on uncertain terms. Warmth might be present, but it was conditional. Emotional expression was allowed sometimes, discouraged at others. Over time, many children became skilled at reading subtle cues, adjusting their behavior to match the moment. This adaptability was often praised as maturity. Children who learned when to be quiet, when to comply, and when to withdraw were seen as well-adjusted. Yet this adjustment came at the cost of clarity. Emotional rules were not consistent, enough to feel secure, yet not flexible enough to feel open. The coexistence of opposing philosophies also created generational tension. Grandparents often favored stricter methods, while younger parents were more exposed to emerging ideas about emotional care. Advice from family members sometimes contradicted advice from doctors or books, leaving parents uncertain whom to trust. Media added to the confusion. Some television programs portrayed warm, understanding parents who guided children through conversation. Others reinforced firm authority and quick correction. These images blended together, creating an ideal that was difficult to replicate in real life. In many homes, this resulted in rapid shifts between approaches. A parent might respond patiently one day, then enforce strict consequences the next for similar behavior. These shifts were rarely explained to the child. From the child's perspective, the rules felt stable, but the emotional response did not. Children learned that behavior mattered more than feelings. Expressing emotion was acceptable only if it did not interfere with expectations. Strong reactions were often met with correction rather than curiosity. Over time, some children learned to suppress confusion or distress, focusing instead on meeting external standards. Parents, meanwhile, carried quiet guilt. When strictness felt cold, they worried they were doing harm. When warmth felt indulgent, they worried they were losing control. Without clear guidance on how to integrate these approaches, many simply alternated between them. This emotional inconsistency was not intentional. It emerged from a cultural moment in transition. Old certainties were beginning to loosen, but no new consensus had yet formed. Parents were navigating unfamiliar territory with limited tools. Experts themselves disagreed, but rarely openly. New theories were introduced cautiously, often softened to fit existing norms. Rather than replacing authority, they were layered on top of it. The result was guidance that sounded compassionate but still prioritized control. For children, this environment required constant adjustment. They learned to comply outwardly while managing their inner experiences privately. Emotional clarity was replaced by emotional caution. This pattern would later be recognized as confusing and, at times, stressful. But during the 1950s, it was rarely acknowledged. The surface order of family life masked the complexity beneath. The contradiction between warmth and control did not break the system, but it strained it. It introduced uncertainty into a framework built on certainty. And within that uncertainty, children learned not just how to behave, but how to navigate inconsistency itself. This quiet tension between affection and authority would continue to shape family life long after the decade ended, leaving subtle marks on how emotions, rules, and relationships were understood for generations to come. As these conflicting philosophies played out in daily life, many households developed a pattern of emotional inconsistency that was rarely named but deeply felt. The structure of the day might be predictable: meals on time, routines followed, rules clearly stated, but the emotional atmosphere surrounding those rules often shifted without warning. Parents were expected to be firm and affectionate, authoritative and gentle, consistent and flexible. Yet few were shown how to integrate these qualities smoothly. Instead, they moved between them, often reacting to stress, fatigue, or social pressure rather than intention. A child might receive warmth and reassurance in the morning, only to encounter strict correction for similar behavior later that day. This inconsistency was not always dramatic. Often, it appeared in small moments: a question answered patiently one time and dismissed the next, a mistake forgiven one day and corrected firmly another. To adults, these variations felt minor. To children, they introduced uncertainty. Children rely on patterns not just to understand rules, but to feel secure. When emotional responses change unpredictably, children learn to monitor mood as closely as behavior. They begin to pay attention not just to what is allowed, but to when and under what emotional conditions. In many homes, this led children to become highly observant. They learned to read facial expressions, tone of voice, and subtle shifts in posture. These skills helped them anticipate reactions and adjust behavior accordingly. Compliance became not just obedience to rules, but responsiveness to emotional cues. This adaptability was often praised. Children who learned to know better or read the room were seen as mature and well-behaved. Adults admired their restraint and awareness. Rarely did anyone ask what it cost to develop that level of vigilance so early. Parents, meanwhile, often felt caught between ideals. When they enforced rules strictly, they worried about being too cold. When they softened, they worried about losing authority. Without a clear framework to resolve this tension, many defaulted to what felt most acceptable in the moment. Stress intensified these shifts. Financial pressure, social expectations, and the desire to appear competent in public all influenced how parents responded at home. A child's behavior might be tolerated in private but corrected sharply if witnessed by others. The message became clear. Rules mattered more when someone was watching. Children internalized this lesson quickly. Behavior was not just about right and wrong, but about context. What mattered was not always what was fair or understandable, but what maintained order and avoided disapproval. Emotional expression became cautious. Children learned that showing confusion, frustration, or distress could lead to unpredictable responses. Sometimes they were comforted. Other times they were corrected. Over time, many learned to limit expression, choosing silence over risk. This did not mean that affection disappeared. Many families were loving in real and meaningful ways. But affection existed alongside strict expectations, not integrated with them. Love was present, but it did not always explain rules or soften consequences. The result was a household where structure felt stable, but emotional safety felt conditional. Children understood what was expected of them, but not always how their feelings would be received. This gap shaped how they understood relationships. Parents rarely recognized this pattern as inconsistency. From their perspective, they were balancing competing demands and doing their best. The idea that emotional predictability mattered as much as behavioral consistency was not yet widely understood. Experts of the time reinforced this focus. Guidance emphasized steady enforcement of rules, not steady emotional response. As long as expectations remained clear, shifts in tone were considered insignificant. For children, however, tone was everything. It communicated safety, approval, and belonging. When tone varied unpredictably, children learned to prioritize external control over internal understanding. This environment encouraged self-regulation through caution rather than confidence. Children behaved not because they understood the reason behind rules, but because they wanted to avoid negative reactions. Over time, this shaped how they related to authority. Some children responded by becoming exceptionally compliant. Others withdrew emotionally, limiting engagement to reduce risk. Both responses were adaptive within the system, and both were often misunderstood as personality traits rather than learned strategies. Importantly, this emotional inconsistency was normalized. Because it was widespread, it was rarely questioned. Families saw similar patterns in neighbors, relatives, and media portrayals. What was common felt acceptable. Yet beneath the surface calm, children were learning complex emotional lessons without guidance. They learned when to hide, when to comply, and when to stay quiet. These lessons did not come from instruction, but from observation. This pattern would echo into adulthood, shaping how many people approached authority, relationships, and emotional expression later in life. The ability to function within inconsistent emotional environments became a quiet inheritance. At the time, however, it was simply life. The order of the household remained intact. The routines worked. From the outside, everything appeared stable. And because stability was the ultimate goal, few stopped to ask what children were learning beneath the structure beyond the rules, beyond the schedules, in the subtle space where emotional understanding should have lived. In many 1950s households, discipline was not enforced solely through action, but through symbolism. Certain objects became quiet reminders of authority, order, and consequence. These tools did not need to be used often to be effective. Their power came from what they represented and from the anticipation they created. Common household items took on special meaning. A wooden spoon hanging in the kitchen, A belt folded on a dresser, or a ruler placed deliberately on a shelf became signals rather than instruments. Their presence communicated expectations clearly, without words. Children learned to recognize these symbols early, understanding that they marked a boundary not to be crossed. What mattered most was not frequency, but visibility. The object did not need to move. It only needed to be seen. In many homes, the reminder itself was enough to restore order. This reinforced the idea that discipline worked best when it prevented behavior rather than responded to it. Parents were often advised that the threat of correction was more effective than correction itself. Manuals emphasized that consequences should be predictable and known in advance. When children understood what would happen, they were expected to adjust their behavior accordingly. In this framework, anticipation became the main mechanism of control. Children quickly internalized this logic. They learned to associate certain objects, gestures, or tones of voice with impending consequences. Over time, the emotional response came before the action. A glance, a pause, or a word spoken firmly could trigger compliance without further instruction. This dynamic reduced the need for repeated enforcement. Parents felt reassured that order could be maintained efficiently. Children, in turn, learned to regulate themselves based on expectation rather than understanding. The goal was not reflection, but avoidance. Ritual played a key role. The same warnings were delivered in the same way. The same objects remained in the same places. This consistency strengthened their symbolic weight. Discipline became part of the household environment, embedded into daily life. Because these tools were normalized, their emotional impact was rarely questioned. They were seen as practical, familiar, and even traditional. Parents often recalled similar symbols from their own childhoods, reinforcing the sense that this was simply how families functioned. Importantly, the emphasis on anticipation meant that discipline was often invisible to outsiders. From the outside, children appeared well-behaved and calm. The work of control happened internally, guided by memory and expectation. Children learned not only what was forbidden, but how quickly order could be restored. This taught efficiency and compliance. A small signal prompted immediate adjustment. Over time, many children learned to respond automatically, without conscious thought. This automatic response was often praised as self-control. Yet it was built less on internal understanding and more on conditioned awareness. The boundary existed, and the child learned not to cross it. Parents valued this outcome. It reduced conflict and preserved calm. In busy households with multiple demands, symbolic discipline felt effective and manageable. It allowed adults to maintain authority without constant confrontation. However, this approach also shifted focus away from explanation. If a symbol worked, there was little reason to discuss the rule behind it. Understanding became secondary to compliance. The child learned what not to do, but not always why. Emotional responses to these symbols varied. Some children felt reassurance in clear boundaries. Others felt tension, learning to remain alert to signs of displeasure. Both responses were shaped by the same system of anticipation. Over time, these symbolic tools became part of how authority was understood. Power did not need to be loud or frequent. It only needed to be present. This quiet control aligned well with the broader cultural emphasis on order and restraint. Because these practices were subtle, they often escaped scrutiny. There were no dramatic moments to question, no visible disruptions. The household remained orderly. The routines held. Yet the emotional work required to maintain that order rested largely on the child. Monitoring behavior, anticipating reaction, and adjusting accordingly became learned skills. These skills served children well in structured environments, but they also taught caution over expression. As children grew older, many carried this awareness into school, work, and relationships. Authority was recognized not by action, but by signal. Boundaries were sensed rather than discussed. In the context of the 1950s, this system felt effective and efficient. It matched a culture that valued predictability and control. Symbolic discipline offered a way to maintain order without constant enforcement. And so, quietly and consistently, these everyday objects shaped behavior not through motion, but through meaning. They became part of the background of childhood, teaching lessons that lasted long after the symbols themselves disappeared from view. The expectations children learned at home did not stop at the front door. In the 1950s, discipline followed them into classrooms, hallways, playgrounds, and other public spaces. The rules were familiar, the tone was consistent, and the message was clear. Authority was not limited to parents. It was a shared system, reinforced everywhere a child went. Schools were among the most visible extensions of this system. Classrooms emphasized order above all else. Desks were arranged in neat rows. Movement was controlled. Speaking without permission was discouraged. Silence, attentiveness, and compliance were treated as signs of respect and readiness to learn. Teachers were expected to maintain control, and their authority was rarely questioned. Parents generally supported school discipline practices, viewing them as an extension of their own efforts. If a child struggled at school, the assumption was often that discipline at home needed strengthening, not that the system itself required adjustment. Corrective measures in schools were openly acknowledged. The tools of authority were visible, not hidden. Their presence served the same symbolic function as discipline objects in the home. They reminded children of boundaries without needing constant use. Order was maintained through expectation as much as action. This visibility reinforced consistency. Children quickly understood that rules did not change across environments. The same behaviors that were discouraged at home were discouraged at school. This alignment created a seamless experience of authority, leaving little room for negotiation or reinterpretation. Public spaces reinforced these norms as well. Children were expected to behave properly in stores, on public transportation, and in religious settings. Adults felt comfortable correcting children who were not their own, reflecting the belief that discipline was a shared responsibility. This collective enforcement strengthened social cohesion. When expectations were universal, compliance felt inevitable. Children learned that authority figures were everywhere, and that rules applied regardless of setting. This reduced ambiguity and reinforced predictability. Parents often welcomed this support. Knowing that schools and communities upheld similar standards made parenting feel less isolating. Discipline did not rest solely on the family. It was backed by institutions. For children, this meant constant awareness. Behavior was monitored not just by parents, but by teachers, neighbors, and other adults. Privacy was limited. Expectations followed them throughout the day. This environment encouraged early adaptation. Children learned how to function within structured systems quickly. They understood hierarchy, respected roles, and adjusted behavior to fit context. These skills were often praised as maturity and preparedness. At the same time, the uniformity of discipline left little space for individuality. Differences in temperament or learning style were often interpreted as discipline issues rather than personal variation. Children who struggled to conform were corrected rather than accommodated. The consistency between home and school also reinforced the idea that authority was inherently correct. When multiple institutions agreed, questioning felt unnecessary. Rules were not up for discussion, they were facts of life. This approach shaped how children understood power. Authority was something external and fixed, not relational or flexible. Respect meant compliance. Understanding was optional. As children grew, these lessons extended into other institutions. Religious education, youth organizations, and extracurricular activities often followed similar patterns. Clear rules, firm leadership, and predictable consequences were the norm. Because these structures were widespread, they felt natural. Children rarely encountered alternative models. The system worked smoothly for many, reinforcing the belief that discipline was both effective and necessary. Yet this seamless authority also reduced opportunities for dialogue. Children learned how to follow rules, but not always how to question them or understand their purpose. Adaptation mattered more than expression. From the outside, this world appeared orderly and efficient. Schools ran on schedule. Classrooms were quiet. Public behavior was controlled. These outcomes reinforced confidence in the system. And so, discipline extended far beyond the household, becoming a shared language spoken by families, schools, and communities alike. It shaped not just behavior, but expectations, teaching children that authority was consistent, omnipresent, and rarely open to challenge. This shared structure would leave a lasting imprint, influencing how generations understood institutions, hierarchy, and their place within them long after childhood routines had faded into memory. Beyond homes and schools, popular culture played a quiet but powerful role in reinforcing ideas about discipline and obedience. In the 1950s, television, radio, advertising, and print media did more than entertain. They modeled behavior, shaped expectations, and subtly instructed families on what a good household should look like. Television sitcoms and family programs presented a consistent image of domestic life. Parents were calm, confident, and firmly in control. Children, while occasionally mischievous, ultimately respected authority and learned clear lessons by the end of each episode. Conflict was brief, contained, and neatly resolved. Order always returned. These portrayals mattered because television was becoming a central presence in daily life. Families gathered around the screen together, absorbing not just stories but values. The lessons were gentle but repetitive, rules existed for a reason, parents knew best, and good children listened. Misbehavior in these programs was rarely explored deeply. It was treated as temporary confusion rather than emotional struggle. A simple correction, a firm conversation, or a clear consequence restored harmony. This reinforced the idea that discipline was straightforward and effective when applied correctly. Advertising echoed similar themes. Commercials aimed at families often showed cheerful children responding promptly to instructions. Clean homes, smiling parents, and orderly routines dominated the imagery. Obedience was presented as natural and rewarding, part of a happy, successful life. Print media reinforced these messages as well. Parenting magazines featured advice columns that emphasized calm authority and predictable structure. Illustrations showed serene households where discipline appeared effortless. Rarely did these images reflect uncertainty, fatigue, or emotional conflict. Children's books and school materials also promoted these ideals. Stories rewarded characters who followed rules and respected authority. Those who did not were gently corrected and guided back into line. The message was consistent, fitting and brought approval and security. Importantly, these cultural messages did not feel instructional. They felt normal. Because they appeared everywhere, they blended into the background of everyday life. Parents did not need to be told explicitly how to behave. They saw it modeled repeatedly. This constant reinforcement reduced doubt. If families on television handled discipline with confidence, then real families felt pressure to do the same. Struggles that did not resolve neatly felt like personal failure rather than a normal part of parenting. Children internalized these narratives early. They learned what kind of behavior earned praise and acceptance. The ideal child was cooperative, polite, and emotionally contained. Strong emotions were temporary obstacles, not ongoing experiences. These media portrayals also shaped memory. Later generations would look back on the 1950s as a simpler, calmer time, forgetting how much effort went into maintaining that appearance. The image of harmony became stronger than the reality. Parents, too, absorbed these ideals. They compared their own households to what they saw on screen and in print. When reality fell short, the response was often to tighten control rather than question the model. Popular culture did not create discipline norms on its own, but it normalized them. It made authority look gentle, effective, and unquestionable. By presenting obedience as natural, it removed the need for explanation. Because these images were so polished, they left little room for alternative approaches. Families who experienced conflict, emotional intensity, or uncertainty rarely saw themselves reflected. Their experiences felt invisible. Over time, these portrayals helped cement a shared understanding of what family life should be. Discipline was not just expected. It was aesthetic. Order looked good. Calm felt virtuous. Obedience appeared peaceful. This idealized vision would persist long after the decade ended, influencing how later generations remembered their childhoods and judged their own parenting. The power of these images lay not in their realism, but in their repetition. They quietly taught that a well-disciplined family was a successful family and that success, like the television image, should be smooth, contained, and reassuring to watch. Outside the home, schools reinforced the same ideas about order, obedience, and authority that children experienced in family life. Classrooms in the 1950s were not just places of learning. They were training grounds for behavior, designed to prepare children for a structured adult world. Teachers were granted unquestioned authority. Their role extended far beyond instruction. They were guardians of morality, discipline, and social norms. When a teacher spoke, students listened. Questioning authority was not framed as curiosity, but as defiance. Physical symbols of control were common and intentional. The presence of a paddle, ruler, or other disciplinary object served as a constant reminder of consequences. Even when rarely used, these objects created an atmosphere of restraint. Fear of punishment often mattered more than punishment itself. Rules were clearly defined and strictly enforced. Silence during lessons, orderly lines, and respectful posture were not suggestions. They were expectations. Breaking them carried predictable consequences, reinforcing the belief that behavior could and should be controlled through discipline. School discipline was presented as fair and necessary. Punishments followed established routines, often witnessed by others. This visibility reinforced conformity and served as a warning. Order was maintained not only through authority, but through shared awareness of consequences. Administrators played a central role in upholding these systems. The principal's office symbolized the highest level of institutional power. Being sent there marked serious misbehavior and carried social weight beyond the immediate punishment. Parents largely supported school discipline policies. Teachers and administrators were trusted professionals. Their decisions were rarely questioned, and parental involvement often meant reinforcing the school's authority at home rather than challenging it. This alignment between home and school created consistency. Children encountered the same expectations in both environments. Obedience was rewarded, resistance discouraged. There were few spaces where alternative behavior was acceptable. Educational philosophy at the time emphasized discipline as a prerequisite for learning. A quiet, orderly classroom was seen as evidence of effective teaching. Emotional needs were secondary to behavioral compliance. Fear functioned as a tool of efficiency. Large classrooms, limited resources, and rigid schedules made strict discipline appear practical. Maintaining control was framed as responsibility, not cruelty. Students learned to navigate these systems carefully. Many became skilled at reading authority figures, adjusting behavior to avoid attention, Compliance often became a survival strategy rather than a reflection of understanding. While some children thrived in structured environments, others experienced anxiety or withdrawal. These reactions were rarely addressed. Emotional responses were interpreted as personal weakness rather than systemic pressure. The goal of education extended beyond academics. Schools aimed to produce disciplined citizens, punctual, respectful, and accustomed to hierarchy. Obedience was treated as preparation for adulthood. These institutional practices reinforced a broader cultural message: authority was legitimate, rules were fixed, and questioning them carried risk. Children learned early that success meant fitting into established systems. By the time students left the classroom each day, the lesson was clear. Discipline was not situational. It was a way of life, upheld by institutions that rarely explained themselves but expected unquestioned compliance. Looking back, the discipline culture of the 1950s was not driven by cruelty alone, nor by a single belief or authority. It was the result of many forces moving together: homes, schools, doctors, media, and institutions, all reinforcing the same message. Obedience was seen as safety. Discipline was framed as love. Authority was treated as truth. Parents were not acting in isolation. They were following the guidance of experts, the examples on television, the expectations of schools, and the pressure of a society deeply concerned with order and stability. In a world shaped by war, rapid social change, and fear of disorder, strict discipline felt like protection against chaos. For children, this created a confusing emotional landscape. Love and correction often arrived together, sometimes within moments of each other. Rules shifted, advice conflicted, and authority was absolute even when uncertain. Many learned resilience, adaptability, and emotional awareness. Others carried anxiety, fear, or unresolved questions into adulthood. With time, new research, cultural shifts, and greater attention to emotional health challenged these old ideas. Parenting philosophies evolved, questioning practices that were once unquestionable. What was once considered responsible discipline became something to re-examine and understand more deeply. Today, when we hear phrases like "because I said so," or recognize echoes of these patterns in modern life, we are really hearing history speak. Not as nostalgia, but as a reminder of how deeply culture shapes the way families raise children. Understanding this past is not about judgment. It is about context. It helps explain why so many people remember their childhoods with a mix of warmth, fear, humor, and confusion. And it reminds us that parenting, in every era, is shaped as much by uncertainty as by intention. Thank you for spending this time exploring history with me. I hope this journey gave you insight, reflection, and maybe a quiet moment of recognition. Until next time, rest well, take care of yourself, and I will see you again soon.